Well, I know there's at least one carbon dioxide or CO2 question on the exam. This is for the classroom discussion section. Carbon dioxide, measurement in a confined space. Bob Dwyer, Carbon Monoxide Safety Association. There are several medical questions on the exam that you'll be taking. And I know for many of you, you're HVACR technicians or students, journeymen, apprentices. Look, we're human beings. This is stuff we should know anyway. And it's simple, and it's going to help you explain this to people you work with or that you serve. So we're all aerobic organisms, and we can only live in the presence of oxygen. So we know the complex protein containing iron that carries oxygen in our blood is called hemoglobin. So what's in our air? Our air is approximately 78% nitrogen and 20.9% oxygen. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is approximately just 0.04% of 1% of the air we breathe. Well, a lot of people have opinions about carbon dioxide in the air. But what we hope for here is just a better understanding of what's intended to be in good, clean air, what we breathe in and what we breathe out. You could have several side discussions about carbon dioxide, but let's make sure that we always include measurement. And we're going to be measuring carbon dioxide in this little experiment. Thanks to our friends at medlineplus.gov, we have these graphics. And we'll take a look that air is breathed in, oxygen is pumped, stored, and carried through the respiratory, the cardiovascular, and central nervous systems, where every cell in our body gets oxygen, and every cell needs oxygen. So as we transform oxygen to every cell, well, there was oxygen there, it got used up. Well, we use oxygen in the process of endogenous combustion, or what we call human life. We eat fuel, and with the process aid of oxygen, and not just oxygen alone, we burn that fuel, and we generate heat, electricity, energy, and waste, condensate, and exhaust gases. Heart-beating aerobic organisms exhaust gases, and the most frequent is CO2, or carbon dioxide. Well, let's watch how we can measure exhausted carbon dioxide from a human body. We'll first take a look at a little diagram of what we're going to be measuring. It's not exactly the same shape, but you'll get the idea. And I got to tell you, I've been measuring carbon dioxide for decades. The first unit I used, it really didn't weigh much, but the battery weighed 8 pounds, and it was on a shoulder pack. And I took it in doctor's offices when my children were sick, and I demonstrated to them how much the waiting rooms, how stagnant the air was, even the examining rooms. And when I was told by one of the doctors that I had to be wrong because they just had a brand new system and the control board said the fresh air unit was working and open. Well, I told him it wasn't, and I measured it. When I came back 2 weeks later, the physician asked me how his air quality was because I had that shoulder pack with me when I brought my kids in after the amoxicillin had run its 10 days. I said, "You're doing good. What happened?" He said, "Well, I called the company and told them there was a problem with the box, and they asked me what it said on the control panel, and I told them. They said, well, it's working." And I said, "Well, I had a guy here, and he said it's not working because he was measuring carbon dioxide." They said, "Who was that guy?" He said, "Well, it's Bob Dwyer." And they said, "Oh, we'll be right over." 2 decades ago, I was the only person measuring carbon dioxide everywhere I went when I was doing energy audits. And to learn about carbon dioxide, you've got to measure everywhere. That's how you learn. So we're going to take a look at this little diagram. We've got 17,280 cubic feet of conditioned space. We're going to measure some outdoor carbon dioxide as a reference. We're going to measure indoor of this huge space. And then we're going to have a confined space, a small little bath and shower room of 200 cubic feet, and we're going to put an adult in there. Okay, that'll be me, and we're going to be measuring carbon dioxide and see how much time it takes to see at what level it gets. So we're going to do this experiment. The only source of carbon dioxide in the whole house are from myself and my dog, Sophie. We are breathing in the air in the house. Contains oxygen and nitrogen predominantly. It also has about 4/100ths, a little bit more than that, about 6/100ths of 1% of carbon dioxide in my indoor air. And then I'm going to spend about 30 minutes in this small room with the door closed and a rug put under the door bottom so that there's no air movement. The ducts will be not operable because I've got the thermostat turned down. There is one exhaust fan, but it's dampened and off. So let's see how we're going to measure carbon dioxide in this experiment. The test instrument used for this random experiment was the TPI model, or Test Products International model SP1000 CO2 Smart Probe, and I use my smartphone with the TPI Smart View app. That measures ambient CO2 levels in work and office spaces as well as commercial kitchens. Anywhere you go, believe me, if you want to learn about CO2 and add something to your indoor air quality measurement package for your customers or the people you work for or in your own homes, communicate with the Android and smartphone using your Bluetooth. Well, you take a look. I've hit the icon on my phone. I've downloaded the TPI Smart View app. This first screen, it says tap to start scanning. So I went ahead and I tapped that. There's the unit next to it, the remote unit. Well, I tapped my selection and there's another selection that came up, the SP1000. So I'll tap it. And then there it is, almost instantly. I'm picking up the measurements of carbon dioxide in the space that I'm in. The smart probe is sitting right next to it. So let's move this around. So we place the smart probe outside on a little stool bench, and we're standing outside and we are measuring outside parts per million of CO2. Now this instrument's been calibrated to 400 parts per million of CO2 because that was the worldwide atmospheric measurement at the time of its manufacture. Now this has increased a little bit, but you need to know that this unit has a plus or minus 50 parts per million variance, plus a 3% of the measurement. Now for this non-dispersive infrared sensor, this will work for the accuracy of what you're going to encounter inside buildings to monitor air quality. And this is your starting point, is outside. How much is outside? And then we moved inside and begin our test. So begin our test, indoor air, CO2, one adult person, that's me, and my dog, Sophie. So we're breathing air, oxygen and nitrogen, and some CO2. There it is, we're measuring, that's how much we're breathing in. And we're exhausting CO2 into 17,280 cubic feet of air. I turn the furnace off so that there's no air moving through the building. I've got all the doors and windows closed. Comparing outside measurement now to my inside air quality. Well, that one person, me, is going to enter a 5 foot by 5 foot by 8 foot high toilet and bathroom. There's no windows. The door bottom is sealed with a rug to make sure there's no other air getting into that room. The forced air furnace, as I said, is disabled. There's an exhaust fan, but it's turned off in that room, and the damper is closed on it. So at 643 parts per million, I enter the room. After 10 minutes, it's nearly doubled. We're at 1,282 parts per million of CO2. Now that's my breath. Now let's think about the 6-foot rule with coronavirus. If I'm in this small space, we'll just say it's doubled the space. We'll say it's tripled the space. That extra CO2 is coming out of my mouth. It's in the air because I'm also generating some moisture that's now in the air with my expired breath. And we'll skip past all the other measurements and just jump right up to 30 minutes. It's 2,176 parts per million of CO2. And what did we start at? About 364 parts per million of CO2. Now that's my expired breath in this room. Think of a house. Think of a room. Think of a restaurant. Think of a classroom. I have measured CO2 in my classrooms for decades. Every time I'm in front of an audience, one, I need to know if it's this level, 2,176 parts per million after 30 minutes, we're turning on ventilation or we're taking more breaks. The last thing I want is people falling asleep in my seminars. When I've gone to elementary schools and other schools to do classes for students of all ages, and I see levels this high, it's a wonder that people are paying attention in these classrooms. We've got to be monitoring the air. You can get drowsy, you not pay attention. You could be diverted in thought just simply because the air quality is so bad. You just feel like not paying attention and falling asleep. You think of other things. Didn't seem like much of a test, huh? Well, I did it pretty quick. Total about 45 minutes in all. It took longer to edit and put this little program together. But we measured 385 parts per million outside in fresh air. Okay, we had 643 parts per million of CO2 measured inside with one person, one dog. We had a confined space of 200 cubic feet, and we had 2,176 parts per million of CO2 when one person went into that space for around 30 minutes. Well, I left that little room, went back to the center of the house, right on the island counter in the kitchen, and 35 minutes from the start, we're back to 634 parts per million. Now that's in the main body of my house. So back outside, termination of the indoor CO2 measurement with one person entering a confinable space within a living space. And there we are at 385 parts per million of carbon dioxide in fresh air. Well, we know combustion systems produce thousands of parts per million of carbon dioxide. Unvented systems can be like living in a chimney. You're breathing in combustion gases. The human body was not designed to breathe in that much combustion gas. There may be too many people in a room or building and not enough ventilation. You saw how one person in this small space, I've been in classrooms, meeting rooms of over 80 people, and the classroom levels of carbon dioxide get close to 3,000 parts per million. We take more breaks. I don't want people falling asleep or not paying attention. In my classes, I've got important information. I want you to start testing this stuff for yourself. If we're taking a look at carbon monoxide, okay, CO, a lot of people get CO and CO2 confused because they don't use the technology enough. But we can have carbon monoxide in low levels coming from unvented combustion systems, as well as a large increase of carbon dioxide. And there's other scenarios where measuring carbon dioxide could take place, meeting rooms. The unit that's sitting on that table there, that measures CO, CO2, temperature, relative humidity. It'll data log. It'll give us a good report. But let's take a look when we start having some crowding. When that previous picture had us starting in a room by ourselves in the wintertime, that was me. That was before anybody came over to visit. We were around 700 parts per million of CO2 in that space. So my wife comes back from the store, and immediately the levels go up to 1,355 parts per million. Then a little bit later, my daughter comes over. We have 2,282 parts per million. My dog Sophie gets all excited, starts running around. A friend of hers comes over right about the same time. As we drop down off of the 2282, again, we got another two people show up. We've got 3,706 parts per million of CO2. And pretty soon, as we look over to the bottom left, then we're over 4,000 parts per million of CO2 in a space. And yes, they were coming over. I knew they were coming over. I had them all get into one room so that we could make this test experiment. When you have this kind of test instrument, yeah, I sound a little bit geeky, but if you want to take a look at office buildings or gatherings or classrooms, that's the best place to take your CO2 test instruments. There's a lot of complaints about uncomfortable situations with air quality in office buildings. Too hot, too cold, it's stuffy, I'm falling asleep. People buy energy drinks when it could be just as simple as too much CO2 in the space. Let's measure CO2, carbon dioxide. Fresh air. We need fresh air. We need clean, fresh air. We need oxygen. So what are the CO2 levels of comfort in parts per million? Well, you start getting increased complaints of stuffiness and odors between 600 and 1,000 parts per million, and that's generally temperature sensitive. The warmer the air, the more expected complaints. 600 isn't that far off from fresh air. That's only a couple hundred parts per million. So it's got to be pretty warm inside a home for complaints to begin that low. But when we get over 1,000 parts per million, that's where you get increased complaints of general drowsiness, and that up to 1,000 to 2,500 parts per million. I was just in that 5 by 5 by 8 foot room, and 2,100 parts per million. I yawned after getting close to 20 minutes or so. I yawned again. I've been in plenty of classrooms, and I've measured over several decades. In every classroom that I've been in, I've had the good fortune of having a carbon dioxide test instrument. And you can see, you pay attention to people that are sitting in your class. And so you take more breaks if the air gets a little stagnant. Last thing I want is people falling asleep in my classroom. When you take a look at adverse health effects, well, that's when you get into these constant environments, 2,500 to 5,000 parts per million. And that can happen. People that want to save energy, there's always cold. They may have some health issues. Generally, we always say the elderly like to be warmer. Well, hey, I'm elderly. I like to be comfortable. But a lot of people will be in an enclosed space with the heater on, not realizing that it's stuffy, and their tiredness, their drowsiness is because their levels may be over 2,500 parts per million, and some of their poor health symptoms may be as caused by that kind of stagnant air and too much rebreathing of their own CO2. And also we need to know that combustion analyzers, they have a CO2 screen. 9 out of 10 analyzers out there measure oxygen and calculate CO2. So it's not something you walk around with. You're actually measuring oxygen, and it calculates CO2 in combustion gases. Now there is a couple analyzers out there that actually measure CO2 and calculate oxygen for combustion analyzers, but that's not in this discussion. So do you know what levels of CO2 you live in or work in and go to school, or what you experience wherever you go? And you're an air conditioning specialist. Well, here's the worldwide atmospheric CO2. This is one of them from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. I started measuring CO2 in the early 1980s with that 8-pound shoulder pack I talked about. You can kind of see how they've continued to go up. Well, we keep burning stuff. And one thing the coronavirus incident episode is telling us right now is that when we stop burning stuff, the CO2 levels go down, because that's where it's coming from. Yes, human breath is producing some, and yes, since my date of birth to now, the human population has nearly doubled. That's a lot of people burning stuff. Yeah, that's a lot of CO2 coming out of people's mouths, but that's a lot of people starting fires, from driving cars to cooking to heating, water heating, industry, pleasure. Measure CO2. You'll find it interesting. No, that's right. You don't have to wonder about CO2 levels in the air you breathe. You can actually measure it. It's pretty simple. You can get the app, you get the smart probe. Hey, they've got one for carbon monoxide as well. That's going to be interesting. Well, that's the segment end for carbon dioxide, measurement in a confined space for the classroom discussion segment. You can find this at the cosafety.blogspot.com, the carbon monoxide news, every day. I'm Bob Dwyer, carbon monoxide safety.